The Second World War is one of those events in human history that just keeps on giving. In a scholarly sense, that is. It was the deadliest war in human history, with some estimates putting the total tally of dead as high as 100 million. It was the battleground of dominant personalities and ruinous ideologies. It was the culmination of events set in motion by the First World War, and we're still living with its consequences today. With the importance that World War II has for us as human beings, one might be correct in thinking that almost everyone and their Churchill has a book of some kind written about it. Despite this though, there's always bound to be certain facts about the Second World War that slip through the cracks. My name is Zack, and this is 5 forgotten facts about the Second World War. Number 5. To some people, the war began in 1937. Were you to research the Second World War today, you would be given the pleasing date of September the 1st, 1939 as its start date. If you look a little closer though, you can generally find an asterisk or a footnote pointing you to the fact that some historians dispute this apparently perfect start date. Despite it seeming as though Hitler waited until the beginning of school term to commence his attack on Poland, and thus launch what would become the Second World War, across the world in Asia, people had been fighting for survival against their enemies for over 2 years. This was the Second Sino-Japanese War, or the War of Conquest, launched by the Empire of Japan against the Republic of China. After a series of so-called incidents between the Chinese and Japanese, during which time small skirmishes enabled the Japanese to regularly point to Chinese outrages or disrespect, tensions escalated throughout 1937 between China and Japan, culminating in the Japanese attack on Shanghai and their subsequent invasion of the Chinese mainland proper in the autumn of 1937. 200,000 Japanese soldiers were landed on the mainland of China for the purpose of fulfilling through arms what had already begun in peacetime. For years, Japanese forces had acquired northern Chinese territory through gunboat diplomacy and by taking advantage of the divided Chinese governmental structure. Despite attempts by the Chinese Nationalist Party to unite China on regular occasions, these efforts were always hampered by the overwhelming force of Japanese ambitions, or by the ambitions of Chinese warlords determined to strike out on their own. Thus, the initial story of the Japanese invasion of China is one of creeping resistance and gradual retreat over the course of a long campaign of attrition, as the Chinese fought for their independence and homeland, and the Japanese fought a war of supremacy and desperately tried to accumulate as much resources as possible for the war that they continued to wage. In December 1937, the infamous Rape of Nanking occurred, where perhaps as many as 250,000 Chinese citizens were killed, raped, or tortured. This was the high point of Japanese barbarity against their foe, whom they had waged a Cold War of opportunism against since the close of the 19th century. Over the next few years, the Chinese scrambled to put up enough resistance to hold back the Japanese, and they actually managed a surprising number of successes. A virtual stalemate had ensued across the Chinese front by the time Japanese military planners authorized a strike against Pearl Harbor, in a further attempt to acquire the resources and territory necessary to fight the bitter war. Pearl Harbor brought the Japanese campaigns full circle, and it also brought the fact that Asia had been tearing itself apart for the past 4 years out into the open. On the 7th of December 1941, Pearl Harbor had the effect of internationalizing the Sino-Japanese War and bringing China into the camp of the Allies, from whom the embattled Chinese could finally receive some concrete military support. So, why is it forgotten today? Because the narratives of the war in Asia normally begin upon Pearl Harbor, people can tend to forget that Asia had been a war theatre for 4 years beforehand. While it may be contentious to denote July 1937 as the beginning of the World War, we certainly do the history of the Second World War a disservice if we forget the efforts and sufferings of the Chinese people before the war widened. The forgotten fact is not so much that the Second World War began earlier then, but that for many peoples in the world, war was their reality before it entered the lives of those in the West. They had suffered, they had died, and they had absorbed much of what the Japanese had thrown at them, and such experiences should not be forgotten. Number 4. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin both sent armies into Poland. The invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany in September 1939 was not an open and shut case. Thanks to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, the Germans weren't acting alone. The deal declared the intentions of both Nazi Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics to refrain from attacking the other party or taking sides against them diplomatically. But there was an important series of additional secret clauses. Germany and the Soviets had divided Eastern Europe right up to their own respective borders into spheres of influence. The Baltic, Ukraine and Belarus were defined as zones soon to be under the control of either Nazi Germany or the USSR, but when it came to the contentious issue of Poland, and with it the problematic question of Polish independence, the decision was reached at to meet halfway. Poland would be carved up between its neighbours, just as it had been at the close of the 18th century. This time, the Prussian successor state of Nazi Germany and the Russian successor state of the USSR would extinguish Polish independence. But the impact on European history would be no less impressive than it had been in the Polish partitions of before. As German armies thundered into Poland in the early hours of September 1st, 1939, the Polish government may have reasoned that hope was not lost and that they could perhaps hold off against the Germans and engender a stalemate in time for British or French aid to be felt. Yet, on the 17th of September, the death knell in Polish independence was felt, as the secret clauses of the Nazi-Soviet Pact were brought out into the open, and Soviet forces invaded their Polish foe for the umpteenth time. After not even declaring war, Soviet soldiers poured into the weakly defended east of the Polish country, safe in the knowledge that the German offensives had significantly battered the Poles already. The Polish state soon collapsed, and on the 6th of October was formally annexed between Soviet and German zones, as the shocked Western Allies looked on. The Soviet invasion of Poland utterly destroyed the illusion any Western leader may have had about Joseph Stalin's desire for cooperation. He had been proven by this action to be just as opportunistic and scheming as his German counterpart, and would evidently never agree to establish the kind of alliance system of the previous war. The spectacle of German-Soviet cooperation was incredible, considering how the war would progress. And at the high point of the deal to carve up Poland together, a parade was held in Brest-Litovsk, where Soviets and Germans marched and toasted one another's health on the 22nd of September 1939, before the Germans marched out of that city and returned to their agreed border. Brest-Litovsk was a symbolic choice for a joint victory parade, as it had once been the setting for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk 2 decades before, where the German Empire had forced the crumbling Russian Empire to accept stringent peace terms and agree to surrender vast swathes of Russian territory. The parade may have been a symbol of a new era where Soviet and German could cooperate and live side by side. But Hitler well knew that this cooperation was merely one step in the direction of the strategy towards the Soviets that he would soon adopt. So why is the Soviet invasion of Poland mostly forgotten today? Over the course of the war, the need to co-opt Soviet help meant the forgiving or forgetting of Soviet crimes in the early phases of the war, in the interest of cooperating against the common Nazi foe. This invasion was one casualty of this policy, but it was not the only one. See Exhibit Finland for another example. Most World War II enthusiasts are aware of the dual invasion today, but its significance at the same time may be lost on them. To the Western Allies in 1939, still dealing with the news of the Nazi-Soviet pact, this shocking explosion of Soviet ambition and aggression meant that they would have to fight Germany and possibly Italy alone, and that the war would thus not take the same form as the one that they had fought 2 decades before. Which brings us to our next point. Number 3. The French invasion plan. Nowadays, the German invasion of France and that country's collapse is taken for granted. The Germans invaded the Low Countries and then France over the course of a few weeks in the summer of 1940, and by the autumn had effectively defeated the Western Allies, cementing Nazi Germany's position on the European continent. Yet, it may surprise you to learn that such a victory, and the plans for that victory, were far from certain. Case Yellow was the name of the original plan that the German High Command, up to mid-January 1940, intended to follow. This plan envisioned an invasion of the Low Countries, in a similar pattern to that used by the Germans in 1914. In the First World War, 1914, it had been the Schlieffen Plan that directed German strategy. The plan was fundamentally flawed and forced German planners to commit to a two-front war from the outset. By 1940, though, a two-front war was well off the table, thanks to the aforementioned Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. But debates over how to best attack and defeat the Western Allies of Britain and France remained a tense and divisive one in German circles, nonetheless. Franz Halder was the German general and tactician tasked with devising the best means by which Nazi Germany could defeat its enemies, but he continued to support Case Yellow, and only modified it slightly as the Phoney War wore on. It was thus highly significant that on the 10th of January 1940, a plane carrying the plans for Case Yellow crashed in Belgium, instantly making the Allies aware of the German plan. This was the Mechelin affair, and it caused an immediate ripple in the German High Command, as Hitler both challenged and berated his officers to devise a new strategy to overcome the fact that the old plans had been discovered. Into this vacuum of need entered Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein, an individual who had long since theorized about the best way to go about defeating France. To Manstein, it was imperative that German forces did not repeat the mistakes of the First World War, and so he suggested a radical, new strategy whereby German forces would still attack through Belgium, or the Low Countries as Case Yellow had stated, but that this would be merely a feint to disguise the true focus of the offensive. The now infamous push through the Ardennes forest and the rapid western advance through France followed by the push north to the Channel, was a brainchild of Manstein, but he also had help from Heinz Guderian, a still more radical general who was mostly outcast by the conservative German High Command. Manstein took credit for perhaps the most striking aspect of the new attack plan, that of the wheeling movement towards the Channel and the rapid deployment of armoured columns. When he went to present this plan to Hitler, he toned down the elements of risk that were involved within it, such as the fact that the German flank would be nakedly exposed for the duration of its daring advance towards the Channel. Hitler was very impressed by the plan though, and when Manstein left for the Polish frontier where he was stationed, Hitler was reported to have said on Manstein, "Certainly an exceptionally clever fellow with great operational gifts, but I don't trust him." So why were the contributions of the Manstein plan and the general chaos of the German High Command in relation to planning the Battle of France forgotten? As you've surely noticed already, a level of confusion reigned in the strange atmosphere of competition and rivalry between the German generals during the period. In the aftermath, the success of the German invasion into France was taken for granted, and historians have praised the genius of German military thinkers, as much as they have criticised the Allies for not expecting a more ambitious German strategy than the one seen in 1914, i.e. the Schlieffen Plan. Yet the German successes after the event have since covered up the fact that, up until events like the MacLeod affair forced German officials to change their policy, Germany seemed to be hurtling towards the same costly strategy that was both deployed during the First World War and expected by the Western Allies again in 1940. Though historians have since claimed that Adolf Hitler hated the simplicity of Case Yellow anyway, and that he would have changed it regardless, the Mechelin affair at least gave him the excuse to agitate for real change, and to allow the genius of Erich von Manstein to enter into the equation, whereupon the latter would blend the best ideas of his peers and change world history in the process. Number 2. Operation Bagration. The Second World War is full of battles and campaigns that changed the course of the war and, in the process, altered the shape of human history. Some such campaigns are famous, but as we've seen, others can be infamous. When it comes to critical turning points in the Second World War, campaigns such as the Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, or D-Day are often trotted out. These fit with the Western idea of what the Second World War actually was, but they also obscure its course, and by default, obscure some of the most devastating campaigns of its duration. Of these devastating campaigns, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 is quite well known as the moment when German armed forces were resoundingly halted and the initiative passed to the Soviets. 11 months later, though, the Soviets followed this victory up with the most devastating advance of the entire Eastern Theater, Operation Bagration. You may or may not have heard of Bagration. Bagration the man was a dashing Russian general of the Napoleonic era by the name of Peter Bagration. He was mortally wounded at the bloody Battle of Borodino of September 1812 after commanding the Russian left wing, where the French won a tactical victory and went on to capture Moscow. Operation Bagration was the most devastating loss suffered by the Germans in a single campaign. During the course of the campaign, symbolically beginning on the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1944, the Red Army obliterated Germany's Army Group Center, which was meant to hold back the Russians from the German homeland and prevent a Russian invasion proper. A full-on Soviet assault through Belarus caught the Germans totally off guard, and their momentum punched a series of catastrophic holes in the German defensive line. By the time of Bagration's end in mid-August, the Soviets had planted their seeds in Romania and Poland, and had inflicted more casualties on the Germans than that people had suffered during the entire siege of Verdun in 1916. Bagration destroyed 20 German divisions and badly damaged 50 others. It advanced 450 miles before its momentum truly dissipated, and by then, the Red Army was within striking distance of Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Operation Bagration's overwhelming success is a big part of why the Russians were able to advance so quickly, relatively speaking, towards Berlin in spring 1945. The entire campaign shortened the war by perhaps as much as half a year, and contributed to the sense of fear and disaster which was creeping across the Eastern Front in Germany by mid-1944. Taken alongside D-Day, it formed the necessary double whammy of a truly two-front war that Adolf Hitler had so long feared and sought to avoid. Bagration was an integral part of the Nazi collapse, but it hasn't received the historical attention it deserves. The reason why Bagration remains a mostly forgotten fact is because, as we've seen, June 1944 was the month of D-Day. By the time Operation Bagration was launched, the Western Allies were already up to D+16, and most of the northwest of France was being carved up in Allied pincer movements. Immortalised by films the likes of Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. To those of us that live in the West, Operation Overlord or D-Day will perhaps always retain its title as the most significant act at Operation Bagration's expense, but such competition and debate over the operations of June 1944 is in fact emblematic of the debate about what the Second World War was as a whole. This leads us to our final point. Number 1. The Eastern Front was the main event. Mainstream audiences seem to have a strange relationship with the Second World War. We like to hear of the initial phases where evil triumphs over good, because we know that good triumphed over evil in the end. Perhaps we begin this tale earlier than 1939, as many Asian historians would do today. Or perhaps we prefer to see the Second World War as a series of winding catastrophes, like a load of superhero films that introduce us to the individual heroes, or villains, only to throw them together and see the Avengers strike as one. Some of us will watch all the individual films to get an idea of what brought each hero to the end game. Others will only watch the end game itself. Generally, I find that it is those fans who watch every movie leading up to the end game that enjoy that end game the most, because they appreciate the struggles, the passions, the losses of all involved. At the risk of squeezing all the juice out of this analogy, I tend to view the Eastern Front as that Thor film you never got around to seeing, or the Iron Man trilogy that you only managed to see one or two of. The problem with this being we then watch the Avengers, and we miss the fact that reaching this point has been a long, hard process for all involved. This is the worst analogy ever. The Eastern Front was the main event of World War II. It was there from the 22nd of June 1941 till the fall of Berlin in early May 1945. The Germans and Soviets fought bitter, hateful and merciless battles against one another. The Germans were the conquerors. They fought a war of annihilation and colonization, fueled and justified by Adolf Hitler's pre-war rhetoric of racial superiority and the need for living space. The Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and countless others under the umbrella of the Soviet Union were the defenders, clinging to their own existence and bitterly holding every patch of ground that they could from the invaders. Over time, the rhetoric on both sides became more fatalistic, more deadly, less compromising. It was only natural that in such an atmosphere as this, both sides expended vast amounts of men, money, and materials in order to defeat the other. It is in such expenditure that we locate the central importance of the Eastern Front to the narrative of World War II. It was here that Hitler's vision of a racial war for the future of the German race took shape. The invasion of the Soviet Union was born of his ideology, spurred by his teachings and molded by his goals. Because both sides could not allow the other to win, since to lose meant to die or become a slave, all campaigns carried dark undertones and had the potential to wreak horrendous consequences on the losing party. The German-Soviet relationship was defined by hatred. It was a hatred that grew slowly in intensity until it was so fueled by the massacres, the controversies, and the losses from the war that there could be no going back. German-Soviet hatred had reached a fever pitch, at least in official circles, and this meant that when the once crumbling peasant became the slowly advancing army with vast scores to settle, German soldiers felt the stakes increase and the rhetoric intensify. Every massacre, every policy of starvation, every deliberate act of barbarity was a symptom of the hatred that German felt for Soviet, that Aryan felt for Slav. It necessitated a total war which soon consumed the German citizens' way of life, after years of not feeling many negative effects from the war at home in Germany. It also necessitated the usage of resources for the purposes of either attack or defense along a front thousands of miles in length, which repeatedly changed and bended with the tide of war. The act in Germany of diverting resources away from Western Europe, from Africa, from Italy, and from other projects has been historically underrated and in some cases forgotten. The level of power Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany enjoyed by the time it invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 meant that only a long campaign of attrition could grind its power down enough for anyone to eventually be in a position to defeat it. No other power in the world, let alone in Europe, was capable of performing such a task by June 1941. Without question, the Soviets had help, and they also had the benefit of equally desperate allies, and a massive reserve of land and manpower that they could draw on. The fact is, though, Nazi Germany spent the majority of the Second World War first invading, then defending, and then retreating in the face of their mortal enemy. The campaigns which tell this story are not merely one chapter of the war. In fact, they help us understand the character of the Second World War itself, why the Germans lost when they did, why the World War ended when it did, why the Cold War emerged, how and when it did. All of these are questions that cannot be answered without looking at the war's most important front. So why was it forgotten? Depending on where one is from, an emphasis can be put on that state's participation, success, or significance in the Second World War. It isn't hard to find people on the internet today telling the British that they'd be speaking German right now if it weren't for us brave Americans, and that should tell you all you need to know. When the war becomes a competition, we can lose sight of what actually happened. but the oft-forgotten fact, and a fact which is sometimes hard for people from the West to swallow, is that without the events of the Eastern Front, in which Germans and Soviets battered each other ruthlessly for almost 4 years, the war would have taken a very different course. It was not the Battle of Britain, not retreat in Africa, not the invasion of Italy or of France, nor the defeat of German U-boats, which ended the Second World War, but a long, brutal, and terrible conflict between two mortal enemies to the east, where, upon God's playground, the great patriotic war between German and Russian played itself out. And that's our list. Can you think of any facts from the Second World War that deserve more attention? Put them in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe, since it will make me happy. I have been Zack, and you have been watching a video by When Diplomacy Fails podcast. When Diplomacy Fails doesn't have any podcasts on the Second World War per se, but if you'd like to follow the link below and stop by, I'm sure you'll find something that takes your fancy. Thanks for watching.